A plenary session to elect a new president of the Pan-African Parliament ended late last night with no progress over a dispute over the geographical rotation of who leads that institution. There was mayhem, to say the least, over whether a letter purportedly from the AU Commission should be admissible in settling this dispute. The conflict has pitted different regions of the continent against each other, with Zimbabwe, backed by South Africa, leading the charge for a rotation in the presidency. But just a handful of AU member states have signed or ratified the Malabo Protocol, which deals with the rules of the continental body. The battle for control of the Pan-African Parliament does not bode well for African unity and is perhaps a symptom of deep divisions between Francophone and English-speaking countries. That's just some context to the story. Chris Maroleng is the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. He joins us now to weigh in on these really shocking developments, Chris. I mean, those scenes coming from the floor of the Pan-African Parliament in Midrand, it's hard to sort of balance that against what's supposed to be the duty, the role of the Pan-African Parliament on the continent.
Absolutely, Michelle, and good morning to you. I think the events that unfolded at the Pan-African Parliament in Midrand at least can be called to be extremely unparliamentary and really indicative of some deep-rooted or structural problems that face not just the Pan-African Parliament, but really issues of these multilateral organizations that are established like the Pan-African Parliament as a platform for discussion and also as an advisory body for the executive that is really established also in a way to enhance the unity of the African continent. In actual fact, what we're seeing is that questions around regional dynamics, questions around clashes of culture, and I think more importantly, questions around really a lack of good governance reflect the debacle that we've seen unfolding at the Pan-African Parliament.
I mean, is it just too big of a job that the Pan-African Parliament has? Is the continent just too fractured? You talked about regional dynamics, you talked about clashes of culture. I mean, clearly the people, the MPs making up the Pan-African Parliament, it doesn't look like they're up to the job, if indeed the job itself is such a hard one, given the different dynamics of different countries on the continent.
Yeah, I think one of the key things, if we're going to look at this in a very structural and functional approach, is really then to question whether enough was done at its inception to put into play and to mitigate against these cultural nuances that make it difficult for maybe MPs in the Pan-African Parliament to engage each other because there are different expectations around conduct, around decorum, etc. The other aspect maybe that we need to talk about really is this question of regional dynamics and then again linguistics. We understand that in many ways the tensions that emerge in the Pan-African Parliament see Francophone Africans really contesting Anglophone Africans. This is bizarre, Michelle, if you consider the fact that we are really defining ourselves in very colonial terms, using these linguistic references and not focusing on the job of the Pan-African Parliament, which is really to act in its first instance as an advisory and decision-making body for the African Union, which is this multilateral body, which itself has been facing severe scrutiny and questions about its efficacy and its ability to deal with contemporary challenges facing Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, let's talk about the issue that led to those scuffles breaking out just yesterday, this issue of the rotation of the leadership of the Pan-African Parliament. So obviously no election has happened as yet. Those who are opposed to the election happening are calling for this rotational leadership. The question is, have these countries taken all of the, shall we call it, administrative steps so that rotational leadership is even on the table?
Look, you know, this is the exact question. If it's a Pan-African Parliament and you are lawmakers, then there are specific rules that apply, that determine the way in which you engage each other. If for the convenience or for political expediency, these rules are overlooked for political interest, then it is no surprise that it ends up in the kind of conflictual dynamic that we saw playing out very clearly at the Pan-African Parliament. I think also what we need to question here is whether this question of personalities, that is strong personalities, doesn't play a significant part in helping us unpack the reason why we've seen the Pan-African Parliament becoming so embroiled in this turmoil that we've seen, Michelle. So look, what immediately becomes apparent to us is that at a functional level and at a procedural level, we need to see the Pan-African Parliament paying not just lip service to ensuring that the rules of the game are really put into place, that parliamentarians themselves do not get caught up in a lot of these political intrigues that have really resulted in the sharp division and polarization that we've seen emanating at the Pan-African Parliament. And let's hope that cool heads will prevail and we can ultimately see this important body that is supposed in its first instance to play this advisory role to the executive who are in the African Union and provide these recommendations and move to a position as was intended where they can become effective lawmakers and begin legislating like was the intention at its founding in the early 2000s.
I mean, one would have expected, given the context of COVID-19, given the context of vaccine inequality on the continent, you know, a number that was bandied about just last week was that all the vaccines that have been administered around the world, about 1% administered on the African continent. Given that everyone who's traveled to South Africa for the Pan-African Parliament has done so with the risk of COVID-19 really at the top of mind as well, Chris. You know, all of these issues play into how it was allowed for things to deteriorate to this point. But at the same time, there are questions around whether this is unusual for the Pan-African Parliament. I mean, many will say this is pretty much in character.
It is pretty much in character because previously there have been allegations of deep corruption within the Pan-African Parliament, as we have seen accusations of autocratic behavior by some of the members previously. And certainly the character of the Pan-African Parliament is being questioned simply because I think there are no shared and common values by these parliamentarians about what it is that is the ideology and the driving principles of the Pan-African Parliament. But as you point out, this is happening at a time where the African continent is gripped in many regions by the scourge of violent extremism described as terrorism. We have COVID-19 and the need for Africa to really get its act together to ensure that vaccines and the procurement of material to help us come through this and ultimately really ensure that people's livelihoods and the economy of our continent is secured. This, Michelle, is what the Pan-African Parliament should be seized with, but they're not. Yeah. Instead, they're gripped by this deep polarization. And for us who have a deep commitment to the unity of the African continent, believe that the Pan-African members of Parliament have really lost the plot and have let down the people of the continent.
Chris Maroleng is the Executive Director of Good Governance Africa. Chris, let me thank you for your time this morning. The battle of control for the Pan-African Parliament, what does it say for African unity? Of course, that's a big story we're tracking for you here on the AM Report.